How Millionaires Think Long-Term by Wealthy Mindset Audiobooks. Most people who lose everything chasing fast returns were never greedy. They were simply hopeful, and no one ever taught them the difference between the feeling of opportunity and the feeling of urgency wearing opportunity's clothes. There is something nobody tells you about the people who lose money chasing fast returns. We assume they were reckless. We picture someone careless with figures, someone who gambled without thinking, someone driven by greed and blinded by it. But the truth, when you sit with it honestly, looks nothing like that picture. Most of the people who have lost significant money chasing quick gains were not greedy at all. They were hopeful. And hope, when it is met with the right kind of promise at the right kind of moment, is far more powerful and far more vulnerable than greed ever was. No one warned them about that distinction, and that missing warning changed everything. Think about the last time you wanted something better for your life. Not extravagantly, not unreasonably, just better. A little more breathing room at the end of the month. The ability to say yes without doing the mental arithmetic first. The quiet dignity of knowing that if something went wrong, you had something set aside to absorb the blow. That wanting is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of some spiritual deficiency or moral weakness. It is the most human thing about you. It connects you to every person who has ever looked at the gap between their current life and the life they imagined and felt that particular ache that lives somewhere between the chest and the stomach. The ache of almost. The ache of not yet. And it is precisely because that ache is so deeply human that it makes you so deeply vulnerable to the wrong kind of opportunity. As Morgan Housel writes in The Psychology of Money, your personal experiences with money make up maybe 0.0000001% of what's happened in the world, but maybe 80% of how you think the world works. We do not make financial decisions from spreadsheets. We make them from feelings, from the accumulated weight of wanting and waiting and watching others seem to move faster than we do. And into that emotional landscape, into that space of longing and exhaustion and hope, the modern world has learned to insert something extraordinarily potent. It has learned to sell speed like a drug. Everywhere you look, the message is the same. Faster results. Overnight returns. 10 times your money before the quarter ends. The language of financial acceleration is so pervasive, so relentless, so finely tuned to find you in your most tired and hopeful moments, that we have done something deeply consequential without fully realizing it. We have allowed urgency to replace patience. We have allowed the feeling of needing to move now to masquerade as the clarity of knowing where to go. And in that confusion, in the space where patience used to live and urgency now resides, some of the most painful financial decisions of people's lives have been made. Here is the paradox that sits at the very center of this conversation, and it is worth holding carefully. The faster we try to move toward wealth, the more efficiently we dismantle the very foundation it requires to stand on. Speed feels like progress. It feels like closing the distance. But in the domain of building something that lasts, speed has a hidden cost that rarely appears on the invoice until it is too late to dispute the charge. Because fast money does not feel dangerous from the inside. That is the part that catches almost everyone off guard. It does not arrive wearing a warning label. It arrives feeling like vindication, like finally being on the right side of something, like the beginning of the story you always meant to be living. And that feeling, warm, expansive, clarifying, is exactly what makes it so difficult to see clearly until the clarity you needed is no longer useful. And when it goes wrong, the loss is never only financial. That is the truth that the postmortems and the cautionary articles almost always miss. The money, painful as its absence is, can in time be rebuilt. What is harder to restore is the trust you had in your own judgment, because, after a fast loss, something quieter and more corrosive takes up residence in the decision-making mind. A hesitation, a second-guessing that wraps itself around the next real opportunity that comes along, the slower, more patient opportunity that might actually have worked, and holds you back from it with the memory of the last time you were sure. Napoleon Hill understood this when he wrote that most people give up just as they are about to achieve success, allowing fear to replace the very faith that would have carried them through. So, before we go any further, I want to leave you with one question. Not a rhetorical one, a genuine one worth sitting with in the quiet after this section ends. What if the slowest path you can imagine is the only one that actually arrives? What if the road that looks like losing, the one with no dramatic acceleration, no exciting peaks, no story worth telling at a party, is the road that ends decades from now, somewhere real? That is where this journey begins. And if you are willing to walk it at the pace it requires, what waits at the other end will surprise you. There is a belief so widely held, so quietly assumed, that most people never think to question it. It moves through conversations about money like background music, always present, rarely examined. The belief is this: that wealth is a destination. That somewhere out there, at the intersection of the right opportunity and the right moment, there is a door, and if you can just get to it before it closes, everything changes. This is the story the world tells about money. It is also, in almost every meaningful way, wrong. The wealthiest minds, not the loudest ones, not the most visible ones, but the ones who have built something that actually endures, understand something fundamentally different. They understand that wealth is not a destination at all. It is a relationship. And like every relationship worth having, it is built not through a single dramatic moment, but through thousands of quiet, unglamorous decisions made consistently across years. The world is extraordinarily good at teaching us to count money. From the time we are children, we learn about numbers, how to add them, track them, compare them to other people's numbers. What the world almost never teaches us is how to think about money, how to understand its nature, how to develop a relationship with it that is honest about what it is, what it requires, and what it cannot do, no matter how urgently we need it to. And the distance between those two skills, between counting and thinking, is precisely where most financial lives quietly begin to unravel. You can be numerically sophisticated and financially unwise. You can track every dollar and still make decisions that undo years of careful accumulation, because the problem was never really about the numbers. It was always about the thinking behind them. To understand this more deeply, consider a man I will call Edwin. He was a careful, responsible clerk living through the electric atmosphere of the 1920s, a decade when the stock market was rising with what seemed like divine certainty, and stories of ordinary men turning modest savings into small fortunes filled every conversation. Edwin had saved patiently, lived simply, and watched from a careful distance for years. But there is a particular kind of pain that arrives when patience starts to feel like punishment, when watching others accelerate past you becomes more unbearable than the risk of moving yourself. That pain eventually became louder than Edwin's caution. So he moved his savings into the market, not recklessly, not all at once, carefully, as was his nature, and for a while it worked beautifully. Edwin's story, however, is not really about the crash of 1929, though the crash came and took most of what he had placed at risk. His story is about something that happened before the crash. It is about what hope looks like when it has been waiting too long and finally finds an exit. It is about what urgency feels like when it is wearing the costume of confidence. This is the deepest mindset trap in all of financial life, and it has nothing to do with greed. Greed is obvious. We recognize it and guard against it. But hope, patient, genuine, deeply human hope, is something we celebrate. We never think to protect ourselves from it. And yet, when hope is given no patient outlet, when the gap between wanting and having grows wide enough and long enough, it transforms. It compresses. It becomes urgency. And urgency, once it is running, quietly switches off the slow, questioning, protective part of the mind, the part that turns an opportunity over to examine its underside, the part that asks not just how good this could be, but how bad, and what happens to you if it is. As James Clear writes in Atomic Habits, you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. When urgency replaces the system of slow evaluation, you are no longer building. You are gambling on hope. The millionaire who thinks long-term has learned to ask a different first question. Where most people look at an opportunity and ask how good it can get, the enduring wealth builder asks how bad it can get, and whether they can survive that outcome with their financial life, their peace, and their capacity to continue still intact. This is not pessimism. It is the most sophisticated form of optimism there is, because it ensures that you remain in the game long enough for the favorable outcomes to eventually arrive. The primary job of money, understood correctly, is not to move fast. It is to survive, to remain available, to be present when time is ready to do the work that only time can do. And once you truly understand this, once it moves from an idea you have heard to a truth you have absorbed, something important shifts. Protecting the downside stops feeling like timidity. It stops feeling like the posture of someone who expects to fail. It begins to feel like exactly what it is, the foundational strategy of everyone who has ever built wealth that lasted. Continuity is the mechanism of compounding. Interrupt the continuity, and you do not just lose the money, you lose the time that money would have spent quietly multiplying on your behalf. That is where we begin. With the understanding that survival is not the opposite of ambition. It is the prerequisite for it. There is a common misunderstanding about compounding that costs people more than they ever realize. We talk about it in terms of mathematics, the doubling, the exponential curve, the dramatic numbers that appear at the far right of the graph. And the mathematics are real and they are extraordinary. But the mathematics are not the point. The point is something quieter and more demanding than any formula. Compounding does not reward intensity. It does not reward the most aggressive strategy or the most ambitious bet or the investor who takes the largest position with the most conviction. It rewards one thing, and one thing only: uninterrupted presence. The willingness to remain in the game year after year without a catastrophic interruption that resets the clock. Every significant financial loss seen through this lens is not simply a setback. It is the permanent erasure of decades of future growth that will now never exist, not because the money cannot eventually be rebuilt, but because the time those dollars would have spent compounding cannot be recovered at any price. This is why the emotional discipline of protecting the downside first is one of the most misunderstood principles in personal finance. From the outside, it can look like timidity. It can look like the posture of someone who expects things to go wrong, someone who lacks the boldness that success supposedly requires. But that reading fundamentally misses what is actually happening in the mind of the person practicing it. Protecting the downside first is not pessimism dressed in the language of wisdom. It is the recognition, hard-won and deeply important, that your psychological capacity to continue making good decisions is itself a form of wealth. perhaps the most foundational form. Because a person who has suffered a devastating financial loss does not just lose the money. They often lose something harder to quantify and harder to restore: their confidence in their own judgment, their willingness to act on the next genuine opportunity, their ability to think clearly about risk without the shadow of the last catastrophe distorting the picture. I want to tell you about a woman I will call Catherine. She was an accountant by profession, which meant she spent her working life inside other people's numbers, reading the stories that financial statements tell about the health of a business. Over decades of that work, she developed a habit that she applied not just professionally, but personally in every financial decision she made for herself. Whenever an opportunity arrived, an investment, a business proposition, anything that required her capital and her trust, she would ask not the question most people ask first. She would not begin with how good this could get. She would begin with a different and harder question. Can I live with the worst case? Not just financially, emotionally, practically, in the texture of her daily life. Could she absorb this loss and continue? Could she look at that outcome, make it real inside her mind, and still move forward with her peace intact? If the answer was yes, she would often proceed. If the answer was no, she would quietly decline, without drama and without regret. Catherine did not build her wealth through brilliant picks or bold moves. She built it by never allowing a single decision to take her out of the game. She protected continuity so consistently across so many years that time did the building for her. The transformation that Catherine's approach represents is small in description and enormous in consequence. It is simply this: when you stop measuring your financial progress by the speed of the gain and start measuring it by the unbroken continuity of the process, everything about how you make decisions begins to shift. The exciting opportunity that might deliver a large return but carries an unacceptable downside stops looking like an opportunity and starts looking like a threat to the process. The slower, steadier path that once felt like settling starts to feel like exactly what it is: the mechanism through which real wealth is actually built. As Morgan Housel has observed, the ability to stick around long enough is one of the most underrated edges in investing. Time in the game beats timing the game every single time. There is one more distinction worth making here, and it is one that almost no one makes clearly enough. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy are not the same skill. They are not even close. Getting wealthy often rewards optimism, boldness, a willingness to take asymmetric risk and believe things will work out. Those qualities are genuinely valuable in the early stages of building. But staying wealthy requires something almost opposite: a disciplined, ongoing humility about fragility, a refusal to let the confidence of past success eliminate the caution that protects future gain. The first win teaches you that bold moves pay off. What it does not teach you, what no win ever teaches you because it can only be learned the harder way, is that the conditions that produce the win were partly circumstance, and that circumstance changes. The peace that wealth is supposed to deliver has very little to do with the size of the number. It has everything to do with the clarity of your relationship with how that number was built. When you understand your process as intimately as you understand your balance, when you can trace every meaningful decision back to a principle you genuinely hold, you carry a stability that no market fluctuation can fully disrupt. That is the foundation we are building toward, and it begins not with a larger return, but with a deeper understanding of what you are actually trying to protect. Here is a truth that almost no one says out loud, and it is worth saying clearly: fast money is actually more dangerous when it works than when it fails. This sounds counterintuitive at first. We assume the danger lives in the loss, in the painful, visible moment when the investment collapses. Or the opportunity evaporates and the account balance tells a story we were not prepared to read. And the loss is painful, no question. But the loss, at least, teaches something legible. It arrives with information attached. The success, the fast, dramatic, validating success, teaches something far more dangerous, and it teaches it in a way that bypasses almost every rational defense we have. Because when fast money works, it does not just deliver a return, it delivers a belief. And that belief, encoded with the full emotional weight of relief and excitement and vindication, becomes the lens through which every future opportunity is evaluated. The lesson the mind draws is not nuanced. It is not that particular set of conditions produced that particular result. The lesson is simpler and more absolute. Speed works. The human brain is a pattern recognition machine of extraordinary sophistication, and it is always learning from experience. But here is what it actually stores when a fast financial bet pays off. It does not store the objective conditions that made the win possible. It does not note the favorable timing, the unusual market circumstances, the element of luck that no spreadsheet would have predicted. What it stores, with vivid, lasting precision, is the feeling, the specific emotional texture of having been right when it counted, the warmth of validation, the particular relief of a person who needed something to work and watched it work. And then, with the logic that is entirely natural to a pattern-recognizing brain, it begins to reconstruct that feeling as evidence of something it was not. It begins to read the feeling of having been right as proof of having been skilled. The outcome gets attributed to the decision maker rather than to the conditions. And that attribution changes everything about what comes next. Each successive fast win reinforces the attribution more deeply. The bets get larger because the confidence is growing, and the track record appears to support it. The downside assessment gets smaller because the mind has now assembled a history of outcomes that seems to confirm the strategy. There is a quiet, gradual shift in the internal risk calculation. Not because the external risk has changed, but because the emotional ledger has been updated with wins, and wins feel like evidence that losses are unlikely. And then the loss arrives, as it eventually must, because the mathematics of speculative risk are indifferent to track records and immune to confidence. But now the loss arrives not at the beginning, when the bets were small and the financial life could absorb the blow with room to spare. It arrives after the wins have produced overconfidence, and the overconfidence has produced larger positions. And the larger positions mean the eventual loss is not the small, survivable, educational experience it might have been at the start. It is something that requires years to recover from. Sometimes it is something that reshapes the entire trajectory of a financial life. This is the striking contradiction buried inside fast financial success. The very confidence it builds is the instrument of the damage it eventually causes. Confidence in itself is not the problem. Confidence, grounded in genuine process, in a repeatable, principled approach that has been tested across different conditions, is one of the most valuable assets a person can develop. But confidence without process is not wisdom. It is exposure. It is the feeling of being skilled without the infrastructure of skill to support it. And when that kind of confidence meets a sufficiently unfavorable outcome, the collapse is not just financial. Napoleon Hill understood this when he wrote that every adversity carries with it the seed of an equivalent advantage. But he also understood that the advantage is only accessible to those who approach the adversity with clarity rather than shame. And shame, it turns out, is precisely what fast financial loss tends to produce in abundance. That is a particular species of self-doubt that is financial on the surface and deeply psychological underneath, a doubt that wraps itself around the question of judgment, of competence, of whether this person is simply not the kind of person who handles money well. That doubt often outlasts the money itself. It can sit quietly in the background for years, distorting future decisions, making genuine opportunities look more dangerous than they are, making the person hesitant precisely when confidence would serve them best. And between the person who overcorrects into paralysis and the person who doubles down recklessly, trying to recover quickly, there is a third person who is rarely discussed and perhaps most worth understanding. This is the person who draws the quietest conclusion from the loss, the one who decides, without quite deciding, that wealth was simply never meant for someone like them, that the game is rigged, or that they lack whatever quality the game requires, and that the most honest thing to do is to stop trying. That conclusion is the most expensive outcome of all, not because it is permanent, it is not, but because of everything it forecloses whilst it is in place. So before we move forward, sit with this question honestly. The confidence you felt about the last fast opportunity that called to you, was it actually about the opportunity, or was it about how badly you needed the opportunity to be real? Let us talk honestly about fear for a moment, because it belongs in this conversation and it is almost never addressed with the directness it deserves. There is a particular fear that lives inside most financial decisions, not the dramatic, obvious fear of losing everything, but the quieter and in many ways more powerful fear of being left behind. The fear of watching an opportunity close before you reach it. The fear of arriving too late to something that could have changed the trajectory of your life and having to watch others who moved faster enjoy the destination you could have shared. This fear has a name we all recognize, the fear of missing out. And I want to say something about it that is rarely said. That fear is not irrational. It is not a sign of weakness or poor emotional management or some deficiency in your character that wiser people have overcome. It is a genuine signal, a real, legitimate nervous system response to the gap between where you are and where you want to be. The problem is not the fear itself. The problem is what we do with it. The fear of missing out becomes dangerous at a very specific moment. The moment it gets misread. The moment the feeling of urgency, which is information about your emotional state, gets interpreted instead as information about the opportunity in front of you. This is the illusion that costs more people more money than perhaps any other single confusion in personal finance. The illusion that urgency and opportunity are the same thing. That the feeling of needing to move now is evidence that moving now is correct. It feels like logic. It feels like pattern recognition. It feels like your instincts are trying to tell you something important about the quality of the opportunity. But what your instincts are actually communicating is something about the intensity of your wanting. And wanting something badly has never been a reliable indicator of whether the thing being wanted is genuinely what it appears to be. When urgency becomes the primary driver of a financial decision, something important goes offline inside the mind. The slow, questioning, protective part of the decision-making process, the part that turns an opportunity over to examine its underside, that asks what the worst case actually looks like, that sits with doubt long enough to let the doubt teach something useful. That part grows very quiet. Urgency demands immediacy, and careful examination requires time, and those two things are fundamentally incompatible. So, urgency wins because it is louder, and because the emotional relief of finally moving feels so much better than the discomfort of continuing to wait. And the decision gets made not from the full intelligence of the person making it, but from the compressed, narrowed, emotionally accelerated version of that intelligence that urgency produces. As Seneca wrote almost 2,000 years ago, And the truth has not aged a day. It is not that I'm so smart, it's that I stay with problems longer. Urgency is the enemy of staying with the problem. It is the mechanism by which we trade our best thinking for our most immediate relief. The emotional consequence of following urgency repeatedly into poor decisions is not simply financial. That part, as painful as it is, can in time be rebuilt. What is harder to rebuild is something more interior. Each time a person follows the urgent feeling and arrives somewhere they did not intend to go, a small piece of their faith in their own instincts erodes. Over time, that erosion creates a particular kind of internal damage. The person becomes either paralyzed, afraid to trust any signal the body sends because the last few signals led them wrong, or they swing in the opposite direction and become reckless, trying to recover through speed what speed originally took from them. The grounded middle ground, the place where good financial decisions actually live, becomes increasingly difficult to find when the instrument you use to navigate it has been gradually compromised by repeated misreadings. The millionaire who thinks long-term has not solved this problem by conquering fear. They are not fearless. They feel the urgency. They feel the pull of the closing window and the excitement of the fast opportunity and the discomfort of watching others move while they pause. What is different is the relationship they have developed with those feelings. They have learned, not from a book, not from an intention, but from the specific and often painful experience of having followed the feeling once in the wrong direction, to hold the emotion and the decision separately, to let the urgency move through the room of the mind without automatically following it out of the door, to acknowledge what they are feeling without allowing what they are feeling to become the logic of the next move. James Clear captures something essential here when he writes that you do not need to be the smartest person in the room. You need to be the most consistent. And consistency, in financial life, requires the capacity to pause precisely when everything inside you is pushing you to move. This capacity is not theoretical. It is not the product of discipline in the abstract sense. It is built through one specific experience, repeated and examined honestly over time. The experience of having been certain, having moved on that certainty, and having arrived somewhere the certainty did not account for. That experience, held with understanding rather than shame, becomes the beginning of something genuinely valuable. It becomes the reason you pause the next time the certainty arrives. So carry this thought gently into whatever comes next. The moments when you feel most ready, most sure, most convinced that the window is closing and you must act now. Those are not the moments that reward speed. Those are precisely the moments that reward patience. Every genuine transformation in financial life begins the same way, not with a better strategy, not with a new tool, a different platform, a more sophisticated investment vehicle, or access to information that was previously unavailable. It begins with a different question. And the shift from the old question to the new one is so quiet, so internal, that from the outside, it looks like nothing has changed at all. The old question, the one most of us begin with and carry for years without examining, is, how much can I gain from this? It is a forward-looking question, oriented toward the best possible outcome, painting a vivid picture of the future self who made the right call and is now enjoying the result. It is a question that makes opportunity feel exciting and risk feel manageable, and the present moment feel like a launching pad. The new question is different in a way that changes everything downstream of it. The new question is, what am I actually building toward? And does this decision genuinely serve that thing? That question requires something the first one does not. It requires that you know the answer before the opportunity arrives. There is a reframe that, once it occurs, tends to be permanent. It is the moment when money stops being an abstract number on a screen and becomes something far more intimate and far more serious. Money is stored time. It is the hours and days and years of your actual life, your energy, your presence, your attention that have been converted into a transferable form. Every dollar you have saved represents a portion of your life that you gave in exchange for it. And when you hold that understanding clearly, the question of what to do with money becomes an entirely different kind of question. It is no longer a question about strategy or returns or market timing. It becomes a question about how carefully you intend to steward the portions of your life that have already been spent. The allure of gambling, that for the possibility of speed does not disappear entirely, the human desire for more is not so easily dissolved, but it loses the particular power it had when money felt abstract. It is much harder to be reckless with time than with numbers. Return for a moment to Edwin, whose story we encountered earlier, the careful clerk who moved his savings into the roaring market of the 1920s and lost most of it in the crash of 1929. What happened to Edwin in the decade that followed is, in many ways, more instructive than the loss itself. He did not chase recovery. He did not try to win back quickly what had been lost quickly, which is the most natural and most dangerous response to a fast financial loss. He did something harder and quieter, and ultimately far more valuable. He returned to the beginning. He saved small amounts. He made careful decisions. He rebuilt slowly, without drama, without the excitement of speed. And in doing so, he developed the one thing that fast money, even when it succeeds, can never provide. He developed intimate knowledge of how wealth is actually constructed, not the theory of it, not the mathematics of it, the lived, embodied, decision-by-decision understanding of what it actually takes to build something that holds. That knowledge, once acquired this way, does not leave. It becomes part of how you see every opportunity that follows. The moment of internal realization that Edwin reached, and that every person who genuinely changes their relationship with money eventually reaches, is not dramatic. It does not arrive as a thunderclap or a revelation with clean edges and a memorable date. It arrives quietly, almost like something settles inside the decision-making mind. The urgency that used to feel like a signal about the quality of an opportunity begins to feel like weather, real and powerful and worth acknowledging, but not something you are obligated to follow just because it is present. You can feel the urgency and choose not to act on it. You can notice the excitement and give it space without letting it drive. And that capacity, that small but profound gap between feeling and action, is where everything changes. As Robin Sharma has written, the quality of your life is determined by the quality of your decisions, and the quality of your decisions is determined by the quality of your thinking in the moments that matter most. When you can see the connection between your emotional state and your financial decision-making clearly enough to pause in that space, clearly enough to ask whether what you are feeling is information about the opportunity or information about yourself, you have not become less ambitious. That is the misunderstanding worth correcting directly. You have not retreated into caution or lost your appetite for growth. You have become more precise. Your ambition has not diminished. It has been given better instruments to work with. And precision in financial life is worth more across a decade than intensity ever manages to be across a quarter. Mindset, understood this way, is not a soft concept. It is structural. It changes what you notice when you look at an opportunity. It changes what questions feel natural to ask. It changes what risks look acceptable and what risks look like threats to something you are not willing to sacrifice. And ultimately, it changes what kind of wealth you build. Whether it is the kind that arrives fast and leaves traces of anxiety in its wake, or the kind that arrives slowly and carries, woven into its very fabric, the quiet evidence of everything it took to build it. The outer results are always downstream of the inner relationship, and the inner relationship changes slowly, invisibly, through awareness applied with patience across thousands of ordinary moments that no one else sees and that add up across years to everything. High in the mountains of the American West, in conditions that would discourage almost any living thing from attempting to grow, there exists a tree that has been standing for 5,000 years. The bristlecone pine does not look impressive by the standards we normally apply to trees. It does not grow tall quickly. It does not produce the kind of abundant, spreading canopy that makes a tree look magnificent in a well-watered garden. In an ordinary landscape, surrounded by faster-growing species reaching confidently toward the sky, the bristlecone pine would seem almost inadequate, too slow, too gnarled, too modest in its ambitions. But place it in its actual environment, in the high-altitude harshness where the winters are brutal and the growing season is brutally short, and something remarkable becomes visible. The very slowness of its growth has produced a density in its wood that no faster-growing tree can match. The difficulty of its environment has not weakened it. The difficulty is the source of the strength. And some of those trees have been standing, quietly and without drama, since before recorded human history began. Wealth, built slowly, carries something inside it that wealth built quickly cannot manufacture or purchase or replicate through any shortcut. It carries the accumulated intelligence of 1,000 careful decisions, each one small in isolation, each one adding an almost imperceptible increment of understanding to the person making it. Understanding of how money actually moves through different economic conditions. Understanding of where risk hides when it is not announcing itself. Understanding of what genuine opportunity looks like when it is standing next to the merely exciting version of opportunity, and how to tell the difference between them from the inside in real time when the emotions are running and the window appears to be closing. This understanding cannot be downloaded. It cannot be acquired by reading about it, though reading helps. It is built the way the bristlecone pine builds its density, slowly, through sustained engagement with real conditions over more time than feels comfortable to wait for. Now, here is the paradox that tends to surprise people when they first genuinely encounter it, because it runs so directly against the grain of everything the financial world teaches us to want. The willingness to accept less upside, to deliberately choose the opportunity with the protected downside over the opportunity with the spectacular potential return, does not limit wealth over time. It produces more of it. Not in any given quarter, and often not in any given year, but across a decade, and certainly across 2 or 3 decades, the mathematics become overwhelming in favor of the person who never stopped compounding. Because the spectacular opportunity with the unprotected downside carries within it the possibility of the interruption, the reset, the year that erases what 3 years of patient accumulation built. And every interruption is not just a setback. It is a permanent alteration of the compounding trajectory. The person who accepted the slower, safer path and kept going quietly accumulates something the high-return chaser cannot: unbroken time in the game. There is a particular quality of peace that becomes available to the person who has built this way across decades, and it is worth describing carefully because it is different in kind from the peace most people imagine wealth will deliver. It is not the peace of having enough, though enough is genuinely wonderful when it arrives. It is something more durable than that. It is the peace of knowing your process so intimately that whatever the market does, whatever the economic headlines announce, whatever volatility arrives in any given season, you understand how to navigate. You are not dependent on conditions remaining favorable. You are not holding your breath waiting for external circumstances to confirm that your approach was correct. The knowledge lives inside you, built from years of experience, and it does not require the market's cooperation to remain intact. As Morgan Housel has observed, the ability to sleep well at night is one of the most underrated returns any investment can deliver. The anxiety that accompanies fast money, even when the fast money is working, even when the returns are appearing and the balance is growing, is not a personal failing of the person experiencing it. It is structural. It is what happens when you have a result without the map of how you arrived at it. When the wealth appeared faster than the understanding of how to rebuild it if it disappeared. There is an unresolved question living underneath fast financial success that slow financial success does not carry. Can this last? And that question, without a process-based answer to give it resolution, tends to generate a low-level hum of anxiety that wealth was supposed to eliminate, but quietly amplifies instead. Two people can have the same number in their accounts on the same day and be living entirely different relationships with that number. One person knows that the number is contingent, that it arrived through conditions that may not repeat, through decisions whose logic they cannot fully retrace, and that its continuation depends on factors outside their control. The other person knows the number is earned in the deepest sense, that it is the natural product of a process they understand and can replicate and have already lived. These two people are not equally wealthy, regardless of what their statements say. Letting go of speed, at the level where it genuinely changes how you evaluate every opportunity that comes toward you, creates a spaciousness in financial life that is almost indistinguishable from peace. And peace, it turns out, is not the reward that arrives after you have built enough. It is the quality of mind that allows you to build well in the first place. Every thread we have followed in this exploration, every story and metaphor and carefully examined truth leads back to the same quiet center. Not a formula, not a system, not a set of rules that followed precisely guarantee a particular outcome. Something simpler than any of those things and more enduring. The millionaire who builds wealth that lasts across decades is not distinguished by having found better opportunities than everyone else. They are not smarter at identifying the next wave before it rises, or more connected to information that others lack, or more naturally gifted at reading markets and timing entries. What distinguishes them is something far less glamorous and far more accessible. They built a relationship with money honest enough to know which opportunities to decline. The discipline of the no, the patient, clear-eyed, sometimes painful willingness to let something pass because it does not serve the thing being built, is not a limitation on their success. It is the foundation of it. Think back to where this conversation began. The ache of wanting more, the exhaustion of watching others appear to accelerate while you wait, the urgency that arrives dressed in the clothes of clarity, telling you that the window is closing and the moment is now, and that patience is just another word for falling behind. That feeling has not disappeared. It will not disappear. It is too deeply human to be resolved by understanding alone, but something has changed about it, and the change matters enormously. It has been given context, and context, it turns out, changes everything about what a feeling instructs you to do. The urgency that once felt like a green light now feels like a question worth pausing for. The excitement that once felt like confirmation now feels like something to examine before acting on. The feeling is the same. The relationship with the feeling is entirely different, and that difference, invisible from the outside, transformative from the inside, is where the entire story of long-term wealth quietly lives. What this exploration has been building toward, without always naming it directly, is the understanding that financial life is not actually three separate domains that occasionally intersect. Philosophy? emotion, and practicality are not different subjects requiring different kinds of thinking on different occasions. They are three dimensions of every single financial decision you will ever make, operating simultaneously, influencing each other in ways that cannot be fully separated. The person who develops skill in all three, who thinks clearly about what they are building, who understands their emotional state well enough to account for it rather than be unconsciously driven by it, and who makes decisions grounded in practical reality rather than optimistic projection, that person builds something that endures. Not because the market always cooperates, not because every decision proves correct, but because the three-dimensional quality of their thinking produces a resilience that single-dimensional thinking, however sophisticated, cannot match. If there is one principle that contains all the others, one idea simple enough to carry with you into any financial decision, and wise enough to genuinely guide it, it is this: protect continuity above all else. Because continuity is what allows time to work. And time, patient, indifferent, utterly reliable time, is the only ingredient in compounding that cannot be purchased at any price or rushed by any force of will or intelligence. Every other element of wealth building can be improved, optimized, learned, or acquired. Time cannot. It can only be used or squandered. And the person who protects their continuity, who ensures, through careful and sometimes conservative decision-making, that they remain in the game across the full span of time available to them, is the person who allows time to do what time alone can do. Consider the craftsman who builds a piece of furniture entirely by hand, using traditional tools and methods that have not changed in centuries. The process is slow by any modern standard. A chair that a machine could produce in minutes takes the craftsman days. And yet, what emerges from those days is not merely a slower version of the machine's product, it is something qualitatively different. Something with a density and integrity woven into its very fibers, because the duration of the making is not incidental to the quality of the thing made. The time is not a cost of production. The time is a constituent of the result. Wealth built slowly, built with the craftsman's patience and sustained attention across years of careful decisions, carries the same quality. The duration is not a disadvantage to be minimized. It is the source of the density that makes the thing resilient. There is a river in the mountains that crashes spectacularly over rocks during the snowmelt season. Loud, dramatic, impossible to look away from. Downstream, where the canyon widens and the gradient flattens, the same river becomes something quieter and slower and far less spectacular. But it is there, in the slow and wide lower channel, that the soil accumulates, that life takes root, that everything of lasting value is patiently deposited across centuries of unhurried movement. The fast water is beautiful. The slow water is productive. Both are the same river, carrying the same resource, moving toward the same destination. The difference is entirely in how the energy is directed. You are not behind. That is worth saying clearly and worth receiving without immediately qualifying it into something smaller. The window for building wealth slowly, carefully, and with the kind of continuity that allows time to work without interruption, that window does not close. It is not a generational opportunity or a market-specific condition or something available only to people who started earlier than you did. It is always open. It opens again every morning, and 20 years from now, you will either be sitting in the shade of the tree you chose to plant today, or standing in the sun wishing you had. The tree does not care when you plant it. It only asks that you begin. There is something important that needs to be said before we go any further, and it needs to be said with the kind of gentleness the moment deserves. Think about the person you were, or perhaps still are, in the moments when the urgency felt overwhelming. The person who was so tired of waiting, so exhausted by the gap between where they were and where they needed to be, that speed felt like the only honest response available. The person who looked at a fast opportunity and felt somewhere beneath the excitement a quiet desperation that they would not have named out loud, but that was driving the decision more than any rational analysis ever could. That person was not foolish. They were not reckless or naive or lacking in the qualities that intelligent financial life requires. They were human, deeply, completely, forgivably human. And they deserved better information than the world chose to give them. The failure was never in the wanting. The failure was in the absence of anyone who understood the wanting well enough to meet it with wisdom instead of an offer. The ache that opened this journey, the particular pain of watching others appear to move faster, of feeling like patience was just another word for being left behind, that ache has not been resolved by any number. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it contradicts what most financial narratives promise. The resolution did not come from arriving at a larger balance, or from finding the right investment, or from finally capturing the kind of return that would quiet the restlessness once and for all. The ache was never really about the speed. It was about something underneath the speed, a need for proof that the life you were building was real, that your efforts were accumulating into something meaningful, that you were not invisible in the larger story of who gets to have security and freedom and peace. Understanding that distinction does not eliminate the desire for more, but it relocates it. It moves it from the frantic surface of urgency into something quieter and more navigable, a genuine motivation that can be directed toward a process rather than burning itself up in the pursuit of speed. One of the most significant shifts available in financial life costs nothing and requires no new information. It is simply the decision to stop measuring your progress by comparison with others who appear to be moving faster than you are. This is easier to name than to practice because the comparisons arrive constantly and without invitation. Through conversations, through social media, through the specific human tendency to notice acceleration in others more vividly than we notice our own quiet progress. But every time you measure your financial life against someone else's visible results, you are using a ruler that was never calibrated for your life. You do not know their starting point, their risk exposure, their anxiety level, or what their account will look like in 5 years. You only know what they are choosing to show. When you replace that external measurement with an internal one, when the question becomes not, am I moving as fast as them, but am I moving with integrity toward what I actually value, something settles. Not dramatically, but genuinely. Peace about money is one of the most misunderstood concepts in all of personal finance. We treat it as a destination, as something that arrives when the number finally crosses a certain threshold, when the debt is fully paid, when the retirement account reaches the figure that a calculator somewhere declared sufficient. But peace about money is not a reward dispensed at the finish line. It is a practice. It is available now in the present moment through the development of a relationship with your financial life that is honest about what the money is actually for, what it is protecting, what it is enabling, what kind of life it is slowly making possible. That clarity, developed and tended across time, produces a quality of calm that no balance sheet number can manufacture on its own. Seneca understood this when he wrote that it is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the man who craves more. Peace is a posture before it is a possession. And to the listener who has been carrying shame about a financial mistake, who has wondered, in the quiet moments, what it reveals about their judgment or their character or their fundamental fitness for the project of building wealth, this is for you specifically. Set that story down. Not because the mistake did not happen, and not because the consequences were not real and sometimes painful, but because the mistake was not evidence of who you are. It was a lesson in what no one had yet taken the time to teach you. You made a decision with the understanding you had at the time, in the emotional state you were in at the time, with the information the world had chosen to give you. And now you have more. The shame is not useful anymore. What it was trying to protect you from, you now understand well enough to protect yourself. Simplicity, encountered on the other side of complexity, feels entirely different from simplicity that was never earned. When you have moved through the full landscape of urgency and loss and examination and reorientation, and you arrive at the understanding that the most important financial principles are also the most straightforward ones. Protect continuity, think long, let time work. That simplicity does not feel like a limitation. It feels like clarity, like having carried something heavy for a long time and finally setting it down, not because you gave up, but because you understood it well enough to leave it behind. There is a warmth in the ordinary rhythm of slow and patient building that the excitement of fast gains never quite delivers. Excitement arrives sharp and bright and then fades because it was always dependent on the external event that produced it. Warmth is different. Warmth is structural. It comes from alignment, from the quiet satisfaction of knowing that what you are doing today is genuinely connected to what you are building across years. And that warmth, once you have felt it, becomes its own kind of motivation. Steadier than excitement, more reliable than urgency, and infinitely more sustainable across the long, ordinary, beautiful stretch of a financial life being built well. Gratitude is a word that gets used so frequently in conversations about personal growth that it can begin to feel weightless, a sentiment offered and received without the full depth of what it is actually pointing toward. But there is a specific kind of gratitude available in the financial journey that is worth describing carefully, because it arrives differently from the gratitude most people are waiting for. Most people are waiting for the gratitude that comes with the number. The moment the account reaches a particular threshold, and the feeling of relief and arrival finally justifies looking back with appreciation. But the gratitude that changes a person, the kind that becomes a genuine orientation rather than an occasional emotion, arrives much earlier and through a completely different door. It arrives when you learn to see the process itself as the gift. When every patient decision, every moment of choosing continuity over excitement, every protected downside, every opportunity declined because it threatened the integrity of what you are building, begins to register not as sacrifice, but as care. Care directed toward the future version of yourself who will one day live inside the decisions you are making right now. There is a particular humility that comes with understanding compounding at a level deeper than the mathematics. Not the humility of diminishment, not the feeling of being small or inadequate in the face of forces larger than yourself, but the humility of accurate proportion. The recognition that time is not a passive element in the wealth-building story. Time is the senior partner. It brings more to the relationship than you do. Your contribution is meaningful and necessary, but it is not the primary driver of what eventually accumulates. You are not, in the deepest sense, the architect of the compounding. You are the person who chose, day after day and year after year, not to interrupt it. That distinction is freeing in a way that might not be immediately obvious. It means that the pressure of having to be brilliant, of needing to make perfect decisions and identify the best opportunities and time things correctly, is not actually the pressure that determines the outcome. The pressure that determines the outcome is simpler and more within your reach. Stay in the game. Protect the continuity. Let time do what only time can do. Inner peace amid imperfection, which is the only place inner peace is ever actually available, because perfection does not exist in any financial life or any human life. Looks like something specific and worth naming clearly. It looks like knowing, with honest self-awareness, that you will not make every decision correctly. That some of the slower, more careful paths you choose will occasionally look foolish against the backdrop of a neighbor's fast win, or a market movement you did not anticipate, or an opportunity you declined that turned out to have been genuine, and choosing your process anyway. Not out of stubbornness or an inability to adapt, but because you have understood what the process is actually in service of. You know what you are building. You know why the continuity matters more than the individual return. And that knowledge makes the occasional foolish-looking decision bearable. Not just bearable, but evidence of integrity rather than evidence of error. When you step back far enough from the day-to-day texture of financial life and look at the full arc of the journey with compassion rather than judgment, something important becomes visible. The financial journey, at its core, is not a story about money at all. It is a story about trust, specifically the slow and sometimes difficult process of learning to trust yourself, your judgment, your instincts, your capacity to navigate uncertainty without being undone by it. Every careful decision you make is a small piece of evidence added to the case for your own reliability. Every time you pause when urgency pushes you to move, every time you protect the downside when excitement wants you to ignore it, every time you choose the process over the performance, you are building something that no external return can provide, a relationship with your own judgment that is grounded in demonstrated behavior rather than mere intention. That is not a small thing. It may, in the long run, be the most valuable thing. There is something almost meditative in the practice that emerges from all of this, the simple habit of pausing before any significant financial decision and asking one honest question. Not how much can I gain, and not what does my gut say, and not what are others doing. Simply this: is this aligned with what I am actually building toward, or is this the urgency speaking? That pause, practiced with genuine curiosity rather than as a performance of discipline, changes the texture of an entire financial life across years of application. It is not dramatic. It does not feel like transformation in any given moment. But the cumulative effect of that question, asked sincerely at each significant crossroads, is a financial life that increasingly reflects what you actually value, rather than what you momentarily wanted. And the losses, because there will always be losses, in every financial journey without exception, the losses, held correctly and without cruelty toward yourself, do not diminish the story. They deepen it. The densest rings in the bristlecone pine are the ones that grew through the hardest winters. The difficulty did not weaken the wood. It compressed time and resistance into something stronger than easy growth could have produced. Your losses, understood and integrated, rather than buried in shame, become exactly this: the compressed wisdom that makes every subsequent decision more textured, more grounded, and more genuinely yours. You have already begun. If you are asking different questions than you were before this journey started, if urgency feels slightly less like clarity and patience feels slightly less like defeat, that shift is not small. It is, in fact, everything, because every transformation of lasting significance begins not with a dramatic event, but with a question that quietly refuses to go away. You are already asking it, and that is the beginning of everything that follows. We have traveled a long way together in this conversation, through urgency and loss, through patience and process, through the quiet stories of people who built carefully and the cautionary truth of what happens when hope is compressed into speed without wisdom to guide it. And now, at the place where all of those threads converge, what remains is something simpler than any individual insight along the way, something that has been present in every section, waiting to be stated in its most essential form. Fast money creates stress because it arrives without process. Slow money creates peace because it arrives as the natural consequence of understanding. And understanding, unlike a windfall, unlike a market return, unlike any external condition that can be given and therefore taken, understanding cannot be removed just from you. It is yours in a way that no account balance ever fully is. What you now carry from this journey is not a strategy that could become obsolete. It is a way of seeing that compounds quietly alongside everything else you are building. It would be a mistake to leave this principle enclosed within the boundaries of finance, because it belongs to something much larger. The truth that depth requires duration, that anything worth building requires the willingness to forego the speed that would compromise its integrity, is not a financial principle dressed in universal language. It is a universal principle that finance happens to illustrate with particular clarity. Think about the relationships in your life that have genuine depth. They were not built in a weekend of intense connection. They were built across years of small moments, difficult conversations, chosen loyalty, and the accumulated trust that only time and consistency can produce. Think about the understanding you carry in any domain where you have genuine mastery. It did not arrive through a shortcut. It arrived through sustained engagement, through the willingness to stay with the difficulty long enough for the difficulty to teach something the easy path could never have offered. Wherever something durable exists in human life, duration is part of how it got there. The wealthy person who thinks long-term, whose financial life reflects the principles explored throughout this journey, has not discovered a secret unavailable to others. They have not found a hidden door or accessed privileged information, or been born with some innate advantage that placed them outside the ordinary rules of how wealth is built. What they have developed is a way of being in relationship with time that most people are never taught and therefore never consider. A way of treating the present moment not as an obstacle to escape as quickly as possible on the way to the imagined future, but as the only place where the actual work of building anything real ever happens. The future is built here, in today's decision, in this moment's patience, in the choice being made right now between urgency and understanding. There is no other place it gets built. And the person who has internalized that truth moves through their financial life with a quality of presence that changes every decision they make. The realization, when it fully arrives, is quiet. That is perhaps the most important thing to know about it. It does not announce itself dramatically. It does not arrive as a thunderclap of sudden clarity that reorganizes everything in an instant. It arrives as a recognition, the gentle, grounded sense of having always known something that you are now simply allowing yourself to fully acknowledge. You have always known that the best things in your life took time, the relationships that sustained you through difficulty, the understanding that makes you genuinely capable rather than merely informed, the version of yourself that you are most proud of, the one forged, not in easy circumstances, but in the ones that required something real from you. All of it took time. All of it required duration. Money, the most intimate and practical tool of your daily existence, was never going to be any different. It was always going to follow the same law that everything else worth having follows. And now you know that, not as information, as understanding. Protect the downside first. Let continuity be the strategy. Trust time as the partner it has always been. These three principles, carried forward from this day, are not rules imposed from outside. They are the natural posture of someone who has genuinely understood what they are building and why the building method matters as much as the destination. Rules can be forgotten or rationalized away in moments of excitement. Posture is different. Posture is embodied. It changes how you stand before an opportunity arrives, so that when it does arrive, your default orientation is already aligned with your deepest intentions. The river always reaches the sea, not because it moves fast, and not because its path is straight, and not because the conditions it travels through are always favorable. It reaches the sea because it never stops, because it works with the landscape rather than against it, because it has the patience of something that understands at the most fundamental level that the destination is inevitable as long as the movement continues. Plant your tree today. Tend it without urgency, and trust with the full, grounded confidence of someone who has understood what patience actually produces, that time, given uninterrupted room to work, has never once, in all of human history, failed to keep its quiet, extraordinary promise. Thank you. Not as a formality, but genuinely, thank you for staying with this long enough to let it become something more than information. The very act of listening at the pace this journey required was itself a quiet practice of the philosophy at its heart. You chose depth over speed, and that choice matters more than it might seem in this moment. Carry one thing forward, if only one. The next time urgency arrives dressed as opportunity, and it will arrive because it always does, pause long enough to ask a single honest question. Is what I am feeling right now genuine clarity? Or is it hope that has been compressed into fear by the weight of wanting? That pause, practiced not once, but consistently across years, is worth more than any fast return the world will ever offer you. It is the pause that separates the financial life you have from the financial life you are capable of building. The journey toward lasting wealth is quieter than the world promised it would be, and more peaceful than you imagined it could be, and it is entirely, unconditionally available to you. Not someday, not after the right conditions arrive, but now, beginning slowly, beginning with the simple, profound decision to think before you move. Go gently, build densely, trust time. Because in the end, wealth is not what you collected in the moments of excitement. It is what remained standing after every storm, patient, dense, and deeply rooted, just like the tree you chose to plant and tend without urgency. It was always yours to grow.